All right. Introduced to Dr. Earl Byron. He is a scientist with CH2M. CH2M Hill. And he's come over to talk to us today. CH2M Hill, for those of you who don't know, is not just a U.S. company, it's a global company that, amongst a lot of things that they do, they're probably the leader in environmental kind of consultation. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
And Dr. Byron, his background, he got a bachelor's degree in marine biology at UC Santa Barbara, and then decided to heck with the master's. I'm just going to go for the PhD. So went straight for a PhD, got a PhD from University of Colorado in ecology and limnology. How many people know what limnology is? That's what I thought.
Study of blends.
Study blends.
Yeah, there you go. Everybody says that.
So after getting a PhD, went into 9 years of working for UC Davis as a researcher there, and worked in aquatic biology and aquatic ecology, and spent a bunch of time working, you said Lake Tahoe?
Right.
Spent a bunch of time working with Tahoe and other studies before going to CH2M Hill. And for the last 20 years, he's been an aquatic biologist with them. And just mentioning some of the things that you guys might be involved with. He's been involved with simply water, like water chemistry. He's been involved with sediments. He's been involved with fish, aka vertebrates, and invertebrates, aka bioassessment that you guys might be doing. So anyway, and he's here to talk a little bit about things that he is doing and possible pathways that you can take. Okay. So, Dr. Byron.
Thanks.
Welcome.
So yeah, when I was asked to do this, I kind of thought, okay, we'll bring some bugs in a jar and we'll show the kids what it's like in some mud and we'll talk about the stream. And then I saw your website. It was like, oh, okay. This is different. You guys are doing some fantastic work here. So I'm really happy to come talk to you. In fact, I mean, it backed me up completely as to what I was going to talk about. It's like, you're doing a lot of the same stuff that we already do, even at a consulting stage, past, our degrees, past being employed as consultants. The types of things that you're doing through your assessments of Arcade Creek. It really did blow me away, and the website is great too. So it just really puts it all together nicely. So kudos on that. That was really nice to see that. So I want to talk about streams in general, the kind of stuff that we do as consultants, that I do in particular, because I'm going to shade it that way because that's my experience, and I'm an aquatic ecologist, so it's going to be mostly that. And I know some of you, even if you did go into environmental consulting, you might be more on the terrestrial side, botany, wildlife biology, whatever. That's going to get kind of short shrift today because this is more about the aquatic side, and particularly I wanted to mesh it up with the work that you guys do at Arcade Creek. And then at the end, I want to talk also about just careers in consulting in general, the type of things that we look for when we hire people, what kinds of coursework, what kinds of majors in college, what kinds of things that we think it proves to be important later in life, or at least what I've seen. So let's start with Arcade Creek. Let's just start with streams in general. And I wanted to talk about kind of how streams really integrate so many different fields of science together. So aquatic ecology in general does, lakes, streams, marine biology, oceanography. Water is such an integrator just because it dissolves everything, so many things live in it, so many diverse habitats. That's the kind of things that you see in Arcade Creek. And so I was sticking with that. There's an old definition in ecology, experimental analysis of distribution and abundance, and there's 1,000 different ways to define ecology. But the point is, you can see how broad it is, and that we're talking about many factors influencing species, populations, communities, how they all fit in with their environment. But what I wanted to get across, particularly right now, was this idea of the complexity. And even as something as simple looking as this little creek cutting through the landscape here is a pretty complex environment with a lot of different habitats, lots of different communities interdependent upon themselves and on the surrounding woods, and what drains into them is really important. And also there's these kind of overarching things that are governing everything. And energy flow, and the concept of flow anyway fits really perfectly well with a stream, which is kind of nice. But in any type of biological community, energy flow is really what governs it all. I mean, that's what it's all. It's all about where can I get my next hit of reduced carbon. You know, it's just I gotta have it, and it comes, of course, from the plants. Unless you're at the bottom of a deep sea vent, and you probably heard about that. But let's just stick with Arcade Creek for now. It's all about energy flow. It's about carbon flow, and it's all about where can I get some carbon, some reduced carbon. That's what it's all about. Just, you know, in general, streams and what the kinds of things you've looked at and the kinds of things we do, consulting, you want to kind of, we usually end up comparing things to what we would call the natural stream, and I don't know what that is, and they're quite variable, but this is nice because it's meant to represent kind of a small creek with a dark blue low flow channel and a light blue when it's flooding. And you get the idea of how streams normally behave. That is, they have a, you know, pretty far apart the main channel that they're within, but that's really only touched during flood times, and most of the time during the year you have a low flow situation with abundant vegetation and some marshy areas on the edge. And these are the kinds of things that we find in a natural situation, normal, more deeply incised, because that's where the flow is going on all year round, to a less deeply incised and spread out area that's more muddy and soft bottom, that's this floodplain area. The kind of thing that typically disappears in our cities, our ag lands, our urban areas. We chop it right down to the channel if we can. We want to make that stream turn into a drainage ditch usually. Here's this concept, I just, you know, to illustrate. In fact, I've got about 3 slides in a row. I don't know why so much redundancy, except I found some cool materials that people sent me. On in-stream organic matter processing, it's this concept again of how everything is structured around processing of organic matter. But the cool thing about streams is we've got some kind of unique things in aquatic ecology going on. A lake, you know, it's open to the air, and the ocean, and more important, the sky, so it gets a lot of photosynthesis. But streams not necessarily so. Large particular organic matter, leaves, that even looks like a valley-oak, which is nice, even though friend of the synthesis. But anyway, the idea is that a lot of these things are pretty well shaded. They don't have a lot of photosynthesis going on in the stream, but the stream can still grow a lot of bugs that do a lot of different things, and even fish, all based on what falls into the stream. I mean, so the stream can be, you have to look at it as being almost parasitic on the surrounding forest. And some of the very classic, really high-powered stuff in early stream ecology really emphasize that relationship of the absolute dependence of the surrounding watershed. And the stream is very dependent on the surrounding watershed. And of course, you've been looking at, you know, what's happened to your little local creek and problems with pollution, problems with channelization, maybe these sorts of things. And you can see how, you know, how any changes in the watershed and what happens to the creek can really affect what lives in the creek, these communities that live in there. Not that light isn't important, of course, and photosynthesis within the creek, but sometimes it hardly happens at all. Sometimes the creek really is just sucking it out of the forest. That's where it's getting its reduced carbon. Well, really the same thing, except a bunch of boxes and arrows, but just some different words. Okay, I get the wrong buttons a lot here. Some of the same words. These just mean organic matter: coarse, particulate, fine, particulate, dissolved. But the point is, you have these inputs from upstream going down to downstream, and along the way there's a lot of things that chew on them, eat them, that scrape them, that gather them, they all eat each other. And in between, it's all this processing of organic matter. But attached algae is the small part that maybe have formed within the stream itself, the little bit of photosynthesis that might happen. But a lot of it you can see is representative as coming in from terrestrial leaf litter and organic matter that comes into the stream. It's really important. Yet again, another graphic. I just couldn't stop with these. They seem different versions of really the same thing. Sunlight or plants or leaves that fall in, and how it goes through a whole system with dissolved organic matter being very important. But once again, organic matter, carbon flowing through the system, everything eating everything else and coming out the bottom and ending up with a fish that you might want to catch. Or not, depending on what stream you got it from. To illustrate this concept a little bit further, here would be an example of a stream that's wide open to the sun and probably growing a lot of algae on the bottom. That would be something that we talk about with, you know, autochthonous is the fancy word, versus allochthonous, out of the stream. Here's this stream I was talking about that just really doesn't see the sun at all, but it's doing pretty well Thank you. We grow a lot of trout in a situation like that, but the trout are growing from maple leaves or whatever, falling in the stream, not from the algae that's growing in the stream. These are just examples of some really large studies that have been done that when you take ecology classes, you'll go over some of this literature. Hubbard Brook, New Hampshire. This is actually Bear Brook, but this is a weir, it's called, which is a device set into a stream to get a very, very accurate measurement of flow on a small stream. They put these weirs in all through the Hubbard Brook ecosystem to get exact measures of flow. And these were streams that you can see, they're classical eastern deciduous forest, heavily shaded, full of leaf litter. Everything depends on leaf litter. Everything depends on the forest. And so they've done a lot of quantification of energy flow, nutrient flow through these systems, communities of organisms. Same thing in Silver Springs, Florida, quite well studied system down there, but entirely the opposite. These are production numbers, grams of carbon per meter squared per year. Not really important, but the idea is it's a production rate. It's how fast something's growing. Well, down here, look at this. It's Florida, open to the sun, and it's mostly this autochthonous growing its own versus at Bear Brook, New Hampshire, not at all compared to what's falling into it. So just some examples of some pretty well known in aquatic ecology, some of the literature has been developed based on these sorts of systems, and they illustrate some of these differences I'm talking about. Another really important concept in river ecology, or stream ecology, is the concept of the river continuum. I know these things with all these U's, but the river continuum, and it just means the concept of trying to get across is it is a river, and it goes from high to low elevation, and it goes from fast turbulent water to slower water, and it goes from usually pretty clear, clean, shallow water, shaded water, to open, sunlit, muddy, bottomed water, eventually hitting a lake or ocean or whatever. So there's a whole gradual process, and it is gradual. And so that's the concept of the continuum. And so this is something that comes up in our consulting work, because a lot of times people we have clients who want us to evaluate, they've got this gigantic sludge-making plant here, and they want us to say, geez, we're not doing anything to the stream, are we? So they want us to take some samples for bioassessment, samples for chemistry, samples for sediment, things like that, in the stream above and below, or maybe upstream and downstream, because there's 5 sludge-making plants on the river. And you do this, and I know I've been faced with the problem that when you're trying to interpret data like that, that's up and down, gradient like this, you've got that continuum overlaying on the top of other things that we're trying to look at. So it's something that you have to keep in mind, that things are gradually changing, and these are just meant to represent different biological communities and invertebrates that live in these different stages. You also get different mixes of things, where you end up down here with some of these more open water things like plankton is what it's showing here, and mussels and clams on the bottom. And those, you don't find those up in the headwater streams, which are like trout streams, which are fast flowing. You find things that you have to cling to the rocks because it's all fast flowing. And also, you find interesting things that characterize them, such as the gills, like stoneflies. They just don't live anywhere else. And you look at these stoneflies, and they just have these little tiny gills, and as you look at it more, you realize this has to be in a very fast-flowing, well-oxygenated stream. So some of these things they're very characteristic of clean water systems, and these are very characteristic and very tolerant, we call them. So when you're doing, if any of you are involved in the bioassessment stuff at Arcade Creek, you try to classify invertebrates on the basis of tolerance values, it's called. And so someone has gone through the literature and looked at these different things and said, these things usually are pretty tolerant of a lot of different levels of, say, oxygen or sediment in the water, or even a lot of pollutants. They might be fairly tolerant, whereas a lot of these organisms aren't. And we're doing a lot of work now with bioassessment on the effects, as an example, of coal mines and, lots of different things that are in mountainous areas. And this is one of the things that we look at, is what are the ratio of these different types of critters that are either tolerant or intolerant of conditions of pollution or of sedimentation or low oxygen or of higher temperatures. I haven't been mentioning temperature, but that's an important thing too, so that you have natural shading of forests keeps temperatures lower. And so the natural condition for our streams here as you exit the valley and go up the foothills is more shaded, cooler stream. Of course, they're up in the mountains, they're near the snow too, but still, they're more shaded naturally. And that keeps the water cooler and allows things like salmon that we're trying to restore throughout the valley to go on up into the foothills and into the mountains. To allow those salmon to go up safely and allow them to rear eggs and young in a cooler water. They need cooler water conditions. But that's part of this natural gradient too, cooler and warmer. And, you know, it's all real intuitive. I mean, if you really thought about it, you could fill that stuff out loud, I think, just by your own, you know, common sense. But there's some of these things that really have a lot of detail to them as well. Stuff not detail. We don't have to get into a lot of chemistry, but I thought, you know, it's just when we're talking about streams and the continuum and stream ecosystems in general, or lakes or anything, we might as well talk about macronutrients, a couple anyway, of the main nutrients that are important. You may have heard of the acronym CHOMPS. I can't even say it. CHOMPS. CHOMPS. That's what we all need. That's what everything needs. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur. Let's just talk about a couple of those. Let's talk about nitrogen and phosphorus as being the key, what we call macronutrients. Natural part of everything. I mean, in fact, I'm one ahead of myself. Let's start with nitrogen. Well, and you know, I don't know how much chemistry or biology, whatever that you might know about this, but it's kind of important how they behave and how much and what you need them for. You need nitrogen for everything, right? Amino acids, proteins, nitrogen. You got to have it. You break those down, you excrete it, nitrogen. So they're part of a cycle you can think of just within your own body. But that's everybody else's bodies too, including all the way down to the algae. And it's all around us. You know, every breath. 80% of what you're breathing in and out is, get a little stuffy here, might be more or less, I don't know, but is nitrogen, right? Inert nitrogen. Nitrogen that's just, it just doesn't react, it just goes in and out of your body. So inert, that's not going to do us any good. But miracle of evolution, we have a few organisms, thank goodness, that do a process called fixing nitrogen. And they have the specialized microbes and within nodules of certain plants, and then things like what we call blue-green algae, which are cyanophytic bacteria, will accomplish this process of nitrogen fixation into their bodies from nitrogen gas. So that's really cool. All of a sudden you have all this nitrogen nobody can use, boom, now it's in the food chain. Here. And then the whole cycle goes crazy and starts, and everything starts eating everything else and excreting and whatever, and you have decomposition, of course. So you look at the arrows going in different directions and get the concept that things die and decompose, and it goes back to plants because they love ammonia. Ammonium, in this case NH4+, ammonium. Ammonia, NH3 is the toxic form. But this is the ion that the plants love. Animals excrete it, of course. And then, you know, there are these oxidation phases that take us on to nitrate and other compounds. And then there's kind of an interesting thing that we really make use of in wastewater treatment called denitrification. There's specialized bugs that turn this back into that nitrogen gas that nobody likes, nobody can use. And they specialize in that. There's some bacteria that specialize in the process of denitrification. Take us all the way to nitrogen gas, and the whole cycle goes around, and it gets all crazy in here, but it goes around the circle. So, same thing for phosphorus, but phosphorus, now, so this is another major one that we need, right? What do you need phosphorus for? I mean, it's bones. You got a lot of phosphorus in your bones. You ever heard of ATP or your cell membranes or DNA, for heaven's sake? Anyway, phosphorus, you need, phosphorus is something we all need, and by we, once again, I mean all the way down to algae. So everything needs phosphorus, but here's the trick. It's not in the air. You're not breathing it in every breath unless it's really dusty in here. Yeah, but it's in the dirt, it's in the soil, it's in rock, it erodes, it's in soil. You know, let's ignore the sewage for the moment. And so it's in the soil, and it can be eroded and moved downstream into aquatic ecosystems like Arcade Creek or any other one. But back to that point that I was trying to make about it's in everything in your body, and you really need it, and it's not in the air, and where do we get it? It really absorbs this, particularly the phosphate ion. There's kind of a primary form to be taken up and used by organisms is just absorptive, and it's on silt, and it's in dirt, and it sticks. And it's really not in the liquid form, and it's hard to get, is my point. It ends up in the mud, it's not in the air, it's hardly in the water at all. So if aquatic organisms, and particularly now I'm talking about the algae that needed to grow to start the whole thing kicking off, the algae that really kick off the whole process, they just grab it. I mean, phosphorus is in such short supply in the natural environment, not a polluted environment, but in the natural environment, that there's a lot of algae that are just adapted for, they get it and they just like a chipmunk with their cheeks full, they got phosphorus, okay, and just like get out of here because, they just got the phosphorus. They hold on to it and they use it to grow it later, even later. They can hold it and store it. It's so valuable in a natural ecosystem. We exacerbate the problem because of things like sewage or things like urban runoff, erosion, which remember I said it's in the dirt, and so erosion is going to add more phosphorus. And since these algae and things that live in the water are just hungry for phosphorus all the time, they go bonkers when they see it, and so they grow, and you get bright green lakes, and you get oxygen depletion, and you get overgrowth of plants in the water. All kinds of nasty things happen if there's too much of it, because everything is adapted for there being a very, very little amount. Same thing like nitrogen. I mean, it has a cycle of decay, of production, remineralization, we call it, from if it's in soils or if it's decaying, one of these things that's taken up is eventually decaying. That would be the process of mineralization or remineralization, where it ends up back as a dissolved form that can be taken up by plants or bacteria. But you see all these arrows going in both directions because things are taking it up and decomposing. And so as a consequence, when you go out to look at phosphorus in the environment, it's in the sediment and it's in the organisms. There's not much in between. Not like nitrogen. But very, very important to life. So I've been talking about sort of like basic principles of stream ecology, but I wanted to also just, fit it in kind of, because I did think it was so cool what you guys are monitoring and looking at for Arcade Creek. And you're looking at kind of, the impacted stream that goes through the city and what kinds of things happen to it. And so that's this concept that I was just saying, city stream, country stream. So we've kind of just mostly been talking about the country stream, if you will. But now, that's the untamed river, and it naturally floods, and that was that, I think that second slide I showed you of the floodplain, which is so often not found in urban situations, because we just don't allow, we don't have enough room to allow rivers to naturally flood, but of course that adds silt. The mud that goes out and settles out, which is very productive to surrounding forests, if allowed to do so naturally, but rarely now. And they meander from side to side. That's just physics. As they start in one direction, anything start, and then it cuts on the outer bank, and deposits mud on one bank and cuts on the outer, and it does that, and meanders and makes floodplain lakes. Very complex habitats with a riparian zone that overshadows the creeks, with diverse species. But when we want to tame it, we want to make it go, we want to build a city, and we don't mind having the creek go through there. That's nice, but we sure don't want it to go out of its banks, and we don't want it to flood. And that's all kind of messy, so let's put it basically in a pipe or put some steep walls on it and make it go through town. Dams and channels and straightening, and now it's shooting through at a faster rate, at a higher rate of speed, and also because we have parking lots and buildings and streets that shove all that water, this so-called impervious surface, shuts it all down to the stream at a much higher rate than would normally ever happen in nature. So you get much faster, you get less trapping, scour as it moves on through. Contaminants are transported in from the city, from agriculture, from just our activities that we do. We, just think about what we do in our everyday life with our modern society. We take all these things that were spread out in the dirt, like metals or things that we make plastics and stuff out of. And they were benign when they were like that, but we concentrate it and we make an iPod. And then when it decays, now it's concentrated nasty stuff. And so it's the fact that we've taken stuff that was perfectly, everything evolved and was perfectly happy with when it was all spread out thin, and we concentrated. So there's your contaminants. This is so very common. It's part of what we do to the earth is related to that. Loss of habitat, of course, loss of species, and disrupted functioning, but that just all kind of goes along with it. And I think you've probably gotten into that concept. If you're looking at bioassessment, I know you have in bioassays and things like that for your creek. You know that there's kind of, it's not just what's there, it's how they function and how they interact. It's important. But that all gets disrupted when you have to channel the creek through the town. So, I don't understand this cartoon, and the one salmon saying, well, remember what happens upstream stays upstream. If that were only true. Of course it doesn't. but funny nonetheless, but it doesn't stay upstream, of course, and that's the problem. You know, upstream influences everything else. So RIP, you know, we've been talking about its reflection of course, the surrounding environment and the sources of water and how big the watershed is how much drain, how large the river's going to be, the local water chemistry, the local soil, land uses. But then all these things, of course, determine then the habitats that are actually found there in the resulting biological community that you see. And I think you guys have done a great job of identifying what's out there in Arcade Creek as an example. But you can, and I think with the other work that you've done, you can begin to see how these factors influence what habitats are actually available and the community that results from it. It's all very interactive. So this was a cool graphic that someone sent me. See if I can make it work, because I know it comes in bits and pieces. So here's, you know, kind of more the natural situation, and you've got the forests and overland flow and some boggy, marshy areas and a downstream lake. And when it's raining, and well, also then there's evapotranspiration will go back up, of course. You know, so the plants transpire, there's evaporation, maybe not when it's actively raining, maybe later when it's sunny, but you get the point. Okay, so now it starts raining, and a lot of this goes down into the groundwater. It may eventually connect with the stream channels of the lake, down the groundwater, and overland flow. And it comes into some marshy areas, flooding, natural flooding. This is the natural situation. And about, here's that evapotranspiration, about 40% maybe of what rains comes back up. And this may be, I got this from somebody in Duluth, maybe it's for the Midwest, but I don't know. Anyway, just don't worry about the numbers. The point is the concept that about half of it then in this forested situation of forests and lakes and streams can go, you know, end up in groundwater typically. And about 10% in that overland flow. It's really stopping all the plants and the bogs and the natural marshes and wetlands. There's not a lot coursing through for overland flow. A lot of it ends up in the groundwater because of all the infiltration possible in the natural forest. So you have a city, things are a little different. And so we've been talking about all the impervious surface with all those buildings up there. And what that does is that's going to sluice water through a lot faster into, you know, what remaining dirt there is and soil and all. It's going to sluice through a lot faster. So here it comes. We've got some brown stuff coming now down, and it shortcuts right through what used to be an old bog because it's going a lot faster. There's a lot more surface flow cutting through, and it takes the sediment transport all the way down to the lake. And there's just not much in the groundwater. Why? Because it can't get to the groundwater. Because now we've got buildings.